Because people really feel validated when they feel listened to. Because if you say, oh my goodness, this person gets it, they have a small piece of understanding. I sat with someone last night, as a matter of fact, we were talking about job situations and how things were going, and the gentleman was very distraught, and he has been job hunting for a long time and just started to work with me. And we really had a conversation. He said, I feel like you understand a piece of what I'm going through. And I reflected back what he was saying, and you can just see kind of the tension drain from his face. It was very validating for him to say, okay, wow, she understands, and then how can we move forward in it? And we talked a lot about what he was looking for and how I could help support him. And he had a lot of transferable skills. We just had to repackage them so that he could get a foot in the door in some new opportunity. But it was amazing when you hit that common ground when people feel like this person gets it, they're listening to me, and they want to work with me. You can almost see it in someone's face. Wow, okay, they really are trying to get it. They're trying to work with me rather than, you can feel people that you're like, they're not working with me.
And you mentioned one of the key pieces, the idea of reflecting back. And basically, when you tell me something, I give it back to you and let you see what you said. Kind of hold a mirror to what it is you're saying. That is, we find, very evocative for folks because it stimulates them to think more about what they said and what they mean by that. And it keeps the conversation going. It keeps them expressing themselves. And the more we can do that, the more healthy steps people tend to take.
Absolutely, because we tend to get trapped in our own tunnel vision. I've always done it this way. This is the way I'm going to do it. And you don't open up to other possibilities. Just because you've done it that way in the past doesn't mean you have to do it. I had a friend who was a recovering alcoholic, and he was trying to figure out, okay, well, I play softball, and they always drink after softball, and what am I going to do? How am I going to negotiate that situation? And we really looked at, well, do you really love softball, or is it part of what you used to do? And could we find a different team, or could we find another hobby? What are those things? What is that softball? What are the needs and meaning for you? And we realized that, well, he realized, and he really identified that I really don't need to play softball anymore. I did it when I was younger. It was good for exercise, but now I have all these other sports that I engage in, and I already know my friends. And you know what? Some of those people aren't my friends. They're my drinking buddies, and I don't need drinking buddies anymore. So he was able to identify himself. I just reflected back choices, and he was able to kind of own, well, you know what? I think it's time for me to leave softball and find, other avenues, and I can still keep in touch with the people and do other activities that don't involve drinking.
And like you said, he came to that realization on his own.
Yes.
Just through your reflecting back to him and you're helping him think through that, he was able to make some decisions around changing an unhealthy behavior pattern.
Right, and some people might say, like, you can't play softball anymore, and someone says, of course I can, I have the wherewithal, I can do this, I can be around temptation. And then they become entrenched. So it's really partnering with the person to invite them to explore other opportunities with you. And I really like your example of the young woman and the therapist, because so often people have an aversion to therapy and they don't know why, and they just kind of leave it at that. But if you can explore it and help them see, well, what kind of therapist would be helpful? Some are not, some are. Some are very focused on the past, some are focused more in the future, some are focused in the present. And what do you need, and how can we help you link to them? And some people are like, oh, okay, I have options with the person that I'm thinking about meeting with.
Yeah, and the opportunity to have a conversation and think through that is what's key in getting a decision made on it.
Absolutely. Now, we know motivational interview has been very helpful to people with substance abuse, and it's very helpful in kind of overall issues. Let's talk about, because we are on Employment for All, and we do feel that everyone can be successful with the right supports. And motivational interviewing is both a support for the practitioner or the therapist and also the client, because it engages the client to make their own decisions and gives them the tools and resources to do that. Can we talk about an example that relates specifically to employment?
Well, MI is really about finding the ambivalence around a decision. Like any major decision that we make, and employment is, of course, a major decision.
Yes.
People feel two ways about it, or more than two ways about it. There's pros and there's cons, and how do you sort out which is the more powerful, which is the more salient? MI allows us to engage with the person who is facing an employment decision, whether it's to get off disability and go back into the workforce, whether it's to make a change from one job or one field to another field. All of those decisions will have a lot of ambivalence around them. And MI lets us engage with the person and explore that ambivalence and help them to categorize the pros and cons and think them through very carefully and see what they want to do without pressing them in one direction or the other, just letting the conversation go and guiding it as seems best.
Right, it's a very kind of structured way to help people explore options, which I think is fantastic. So often, we kind of say, okay, these are the two choices, but really there's so many choices in life and so many ways to move forward, and people's recovery is different. We've had on many guests a lot of peer specialists who do a very similar process. They help engage specifically people who experience psychiatric disabilities and help them move forward, but it's very much a partnership process, which is very valuable.
Sure, sure.
Now, motivational interviewing has a lot of research behind it that's really demonstrated its efficacy.
That's very true. There's, at this point, right about 150 studies
Wow.
that have been done over the course of time since the 80s on motivational interviewing. It started back when Dr. Miller himself developed the model at the University of New Mexico and the substance abuse facility he was working with. He had initially become discouraged that the success rate at his facility was only about 35%. It was alcohol treatment, and their one-year sobriety rate, people who graduated 1 year later, 35% of them would remain sober at that point. And that's not unusual for the substance abuse field. It's a very high relapse field. But he thought, well, we must be able to do better. And he'd been trained in the Rogerian model, so he made some adjustments to it. He made it more directive, because one of the problems with Carl Rogers' approach historically was you can end up just moving in circles. You just reflect and reflect and reflect, and no one ever goes anywhere. MI is much more directive than that. We use selective reflections, selective questions, selective summaries to kind of guide the conversation in a healthy direction. He developed the model and taught it to his colleagues. They began using it in that setting, and they found that their success rate went from 35% to 70%.
Wow,
which is
so
a doubling.
70%, huge.
Unheard of, really, in the substance abuse field. They were able to replicate that in several subsequent studies that attracted federal attention from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and a lot of research funding, because obviously if something works, we want to find out why and how, and can we replicate that somewhere else.
Thankfully.
So at this point, it's been explored thoroughly for the substance abuse treatment field. It's been used in tobacco cessation and studied there. It's become the approach of choice for probation departments in a number of states, a number of counties across the nation. It's been used by hospitals to treat chronic illness like diabetes, in terms of adhering to a diet, adhering to exercise, adhering to a medication regimen, helping folks adapt to the demands of a chronic illness, helping folks with psychiatric disabilities with both medication compliance, employment, rehabilitative goals, that sort of thing. The Department of Mental Health has actually sponsored its use here in Massachusetts, and I'm working with one of our community-based flexible sports vendors in the New Bedford area to have several of their residential programs become MI programs.
Wow.
So that's the mode of interaction between staff and clients. It's not just for therapists, it's really, it's a very broad model. It can be used in personal conversation, in employment conversation. There's a lot of applicability of it.
No, that's fantastic, because a lot of residential staff do not have the amount of training that we would like them to have. And sometimes they get in real direct conflict